didn't say no. The day went long. It felt very long. Yeah, it did.
Take care of business first.
Play later. You might not get to your classroom.
Oh, no, it's okay. My duty calls us a citizen.
Oh, I see. I see.
I like that.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Are we ready? We're ready. All right. Good evening. Today is Tuesday, March 29, 2022. The time is 5:01 p.m. and a special meeting of the following will come to order. The Victorville City Council and the same council also sitting as the Victorville Library Board of Trustees, Southern California Logistics Rail Authority, Southern California Logistics Airport Authority, successor agency to the Redevelopment Agency, the City as Housing Assets Successor, Joint Powers Financing Authority, and the Victorville Water District. Madam Clerk, will you kindly call the roll?
Councilmember Becerra.
Present.
Councilmember Gomez.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Irving.
Present.
Mayor Jones.
Here.
We have quorum.
Thank you. We do have a quorum. All right. With that said, we're going to move on to our invocation. And as we don't have a pastor here, and I don't have any other volunteers, I'm going to go ahead and lead us in prayer. That'll be followed by our Pledge of Allegiance by Captain Wickham. So if everyone will stand if you're able. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for always being with us and inclining your ears to those who are faithful to extend their hand to you and incline their hearts toward you. Father, we know in your word that we read through in the book of Luke, you tell us that those who are faithful in a very little are also faithful in much. And those who are dishonest in little are also dishonest in much. And so as we weigh out our great duty here to manage the affairs that you've allowed us to do, you've allowed us to be in these seats of responsibility, we pray that you would help our hearts lean into you and our duty to be faithful in the small things and the big things that you've given us. We also pray that you would help us in our relationships with one another, because we know, Lord, that when we are acting well as a team together, it can only be good for our city. We thank you for being with us. We pray that you would guide us in our decisions tonight and give us the wisdom to make good decisions. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice.
Thank you, Captain Wickham. All right, Madam Clerk, will you kindly present the agenda and any revisions to it?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. There are revisions to agenda item number 1. Revisions were made to the staff report as well as attachment A and B. The staff report changes to the background section. The last paragraph should read as follows. VMC section 2.28.230B states that modifications or waivers of competitive bidding procedures for public work projects can only occur if 1, the city council adopts a resolution which sets out the facts and circumstances supporting the finding of necessity for such a waiver or modification, and 2, such resolution is adopted by a 4/5 vote of the membership of the council. VMC subsection 2.28.230B requires a supermajority vote to pass such resolutions, with certain exceptions relating to use of design build to ensure the competitive bidding requirements for public works projects are waived, modified only when absolutely necessary. Modification to the discussion section, second paragraph should read as follows. To avoid situations where individual council members are given veto power over the will of a majority of the city council, it is important to amend the provisions of section 2.28.230 to allow for a 3/4 vote in situations where there are less than 5 sitting members of the city council Proposed ordinance number 2427, attachment A, would so amend VMC section 2.28.230B, but would not change the requirement for a 4/5 vote in situations where there are 5 city council members currently seated, i.e. no unfilled vacancies exist. Attachment A changes to the recitals. The 5th recital should read as follows. Whereas the 4/5 vote requirement was to ensure the greater than a simple majority vote would be required under the rare circumstances when a modification or waiver of bidding requirements was necessary, but such 4/5 vote requirement does not take into consideration a situation where the city council is comprised of less than 5 city council members as a result of unfilled vacancies. And the 6th recital should read as follows. Whereas in situations where there are fewer than 5 members serving on the city council, it would follow that a 3/4 vote would still preserve the supermajority requirement while at the same time preserving or preventing a situation where one council member would have veto power over a vote pending before the city council. Under section 2 should read as follows. The facts and circumstances supporting the city council's determination that one or more of the bidding exceptions set forth in this section exempts a public works project from the competitive bidding procedures in this article shall be set forth in a resolution requiring a 4/5 vote of the membership of the city council for adoption when there are 5 sitting council members, and a 3/4 vote of the membership of the city council for adoption where there are fewer than 5 sitting council members on the city council, with the exception of a determination of the applicability of design build, which shall only require a simple majority vote. Such resolution shall also specify the manner in which such public works projects shall be procured, e.g. by negotiated contract, by formal or informal RFP/Q, by seeking written quotations or such other method as the city council shall authorize. Attachment B changes. Subsection B should read as follows. The facts and circumstances supporting the city council's determination that one or more of the bidding exceptions set forth in this section exempts a public works project from the competitive bidding procedures in this article shall be set forth in a resolution requiring a 4/5 vote of the membership of the city council for adoption when there are 5 sitting council members, and a 3/4 vote of the membership of the city council for adoption when there are fewer than 5 sitting council members on the city council, with the exception of a determination of the applicability of design build, which shall only require a simple majority vote. Such resolution shall also specify the manner in which such public work projects shall be procured, e.g. by negotiated contract, by formal or informal RFP/Q, by seeking written quotations, or such other methods as the city council shall authorize. Thank you, Madam Mayor. That concludes the revisions to the agenda.
Thank you. All right. And council members, are there any declarations that you like to make in terms of conflicts of interest? Hearing, seeing none, we're going to move on to the introduction to public comments. Before I do that, Madam Clerk, do we have requests to speak?
I have a point of clarification in terms of being recognized for clarity's sake.
I didn't understand your comment.
Would you like, it's not a comment, I was seeking recognition for clarity. It's a
Oh,
point of
sure,
order.
sure.
Yeah, you stated something quite quickly. Would you mind repeating what you stated just before?
I was just simply asking if any council members had any conflicts of interest to declare.
No, I think afterwards you asked for like public comment, but I wasn't sure if that was. what you were
No,
asking.
so that's what I do normally before I do an introduction to public comment. I find out first whether there are requests to speak.
Thank you.
Sure.
I would like to speak as a member of the public.
Sure. And just for clarity's sake, again, that's not a point of order. That always comes up if there's been a breach in practice. But if there's a question, sure. Hold on, Member Gomez. I'm going to ask Madam Clerk first if there are any other members from the audience that wish to speak.
There are members via Zoom.
Okay, thank you. So with that said, everyone, welcome to tonight's meeting of the Victorville City Council. Your city council is interested in your ideas and opinions and furthermore endeavors to incorporate them into its deliberations. At the same time, the council must be able to carry out its business in an organized and efficient manner free from material disruption. Therefore, this meeting will be administered in accordance with the council's established policies and procedures and Government Code Section 54957.9. All testimony during this meeting is limited to items posted on the agenda and must be directed solely to the council. Individual speakers may address the council once per public comment period and once per each public hearing item for up to 3 minutes. Additional time may be allocated for appeal hearings in accordance with the city's adopted policy and procedures manual. Those who desire to comment on this evening's public hearing item may wish to reserve their remarks until that particular public hearing has been opened. Although open meeting laws do not permit council members to engage in dialogue with any speaker during the public comment periods, please know your comments and questions may be taken into consideration by council members when discussing that particular agenda item. The presiding officer may briefly respond or have staff respond to statements or questions, or may request that staff report back to the council at a subsequent meeting. Speakers are requested to comment as briefly as the subject permits. Individual council members who wish to speak as a member of the public do so without the semblance or presumption of authority derived from her public office and are subject to the same meeting rules of conduct and decorum as other public participants. Whether attending this meeting in person or via Zoom, once comments are invited, the speaker will be called on by name, then recognized by the presiding officer. The speaker will state the item number that will be addressed. Audience members may not disrupt, disturb, or otherwise impede the orderly conduct of this meeting, and those who do are subject to removal pursuant to Penal Code Section 403. Your understanding and cooperation are appreciated. So with that said, Ms. Gomez, please feel free to step down to the podium.
I'm sorry, did you say that you wanted first members to speak? I just don't want to take anyone's place. So
No,
if I can.
I know, and
Okay.
we addressed that before I did the introduction. Thank you. So, and again, because this is a special meeting, it's only, comments are reserved only for, or restricted to only those items posted on the agenda. Welcome, Ms.
So
Gomez.
my name is Blanca Gomez, and I was elected in 2016, re-elected in 2020. What I would like to state was there's a couple of items that the appointed mayor of the city of Victorville read that is not within the notification of what each member should have. And I was wondering,
Ms. Gomez, we're only going to, the restriction is to posted agenda items only this evening. Certainly, we can have a, right, so your comments have to be.
would you please stop my time when you're, okay. I
I'm not
appreciate it. Would you say, what would you say? I'm sorry.
Sure, because this is it's echoing a little bit. So because this is a special meeting, all speakers are, their remarks are confined to those items posted on the agenda.
So we're looking at item number 1. Item number 1 talks about the bidding process and the requirements at stake from ARPA dollars and state funding and federal funding dollars. I don't know if it's been wired, $28 million is a lot of dollars. And today, the city council has seen before them the waiver of the bidding process in front of them that would minimize the power of the entirety of what we have. In it says it right up there, 1962, we've had the same practices. And it looks like today is the first time in the history of Victorville, which is that we're looking at the waiver of the bidding process to narrow it down to ensure that whatever needs to be Mickey Mouse is, I think it's not very transparent when we have a special meeting, which is a public hearing, and we produce it when we're not providing ample or sufficient notification, despite the fact that I can predict that the mayor will, either ask Mr. DeBornowski or the city manager if it was notified within time, yada, yada, yada. But there's a different sense in the public when it comes to looking at what is considered limited circumstances. And it really puts it out there that we are rigging a system that's convenient, because $28 million is not just $1 or $2 or $3 or $4. It's a lot of money. And so I know the eyes are on Victorville, and these types of changes really do bring a closer scope on our executive team, who I'm sure works very diligently and very hard to ensure interests. The question is, when we say we're amending the municipal code, and the municipal code has been voted in by the people, why would a majority have the power to go back with a resolution to be able to propose something to continue to conceal and hide things that don't seem to be very transparent? And so I'm very concerned the way that we address, and very suspicious how we end up doing things like this. And this is one thing that we have manipulated, and it's been modified, and it doesn't perceive to be in the best interest of a general vulnerable population. With $28 million, we just addressed 4.8 of them.
Thank you, Ms. Gomez. All right, Madam Clerk, are there any other requests from chambers?
No, Madam Mayor.
All right, with that said, that concludes the in-chambers requests for comments, and we're going to go ahead and take up the requests by Zoom.
Our first speaker is Carlos Rodriguez.
Madam Clerk, my apologies. I guess we do have someone that wishes to speak. Thank you, Member Becerra. Welcome. Yes. Okay, if you go to the podium, thank you.
I think it is a wonderful idea that Victorville was granted $28 million. Hopefully they get many more $1 million.
Could you stand closer to the
I
mic?
think it is a wonderful blessing that Victorville has obtained $28 million to build their wellness facility and to make appropriation housing for the people, affordable housing projects in the things that you are building. So it was definitely necessary.
Yes, ma'am. And so I'm gonna, if you'll just pause for just a moment. I know that the previous speaker spoke a little bit about the $28 million, but she did tie it into the ordinance, which is the matter that's before us this evening. So if you could provide your comments to the ordinance, it would be helpful. Thank you.
Well, I definitely would like to see more funding come to Victorville so that they can build more things, and that the bidding goes properly.
Yes, ma'am.
That there's not a lot of dysfunction, with the.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Madam Clerk.
Our
These
next
are by-
speaker is Carlos Rodriguez.
Okay. Mr. Rodriguez, welcome to our meeting.
Yes, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you. My comments were related to item 2 on the development impact fees. Would this be the appropriate time to comment?
Certainly.
Okay, thank you. On behalf of the Building Industry Association of Southern California, I just want to take a moment to thank the staff and the council for the previous dialogue that we've had on this important matter regarding future infrastructure related to the city of Victorville. And while the building industry seeks to address the needs, the dire needs of housing shortfall that's in the city of Victorville and throughout the county, and we are of the utmost desire to pay our fair share with respect to infrastructure, we do want to at the same time urge the council and staff to also take a collaborative look at the implications of affordability and what the implications would be on the housing market with respect to any additional housing costs that would occur. So That said, we look forward to providing input and having discussions about the proposed increase. And I'll just say that the County of San Bernardino recently released a report and talked about housing as a substantial expense, reflecting the largest single monthly expenditure for many individual and families. Quality housing is not affordable for everyone, and those with lower incomes are most likely to live in unhealthy, overcrowded, or unsafe housing conditions. Housing supply has not kept pace with population growth throughout the region, and instead growth is being accommodated through increases in persons per household, resulting in household overcrowding. With such a high demand or need for housing units than there is supply, both home and rental prices have skyrocketed to stymie the influx of interest. And significant portions of San Bernardino County pay more than 30% of their gross income towards housing payments, and higher housing costs put lower income housing at risk of living in substandard housing or of experienced homelessness. Without a concerted effort to expand the housing supply, increasing numbers of households will become unable to afford housing in San Bernardino County as rents and housing prices continue to rise. So I only mentioned that excerpt from a recent report from the County of San Bernardino to put into frame the importance of having a balanced approach to implementing any fee increase. I also think is of note, according to Assembly Majority Leader Eloise Reyes, in a 2019 report, only 41% of Black and 49% of Latino families own their homes, compared to 68% of white and 66% of Asian families. We
Okay,
look forward to discussing these economic implications and
Mr.
market
Rodriguez, I was going to let you
implications.
finish your sentence, but you're such a pro at this, but your time is up and we thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
your comments. Yes, sir.
I'll end there. Thank you very much,
Yes,
Madam
sir.
Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Madam Clerk.
There are no additional speakers.
All right, Madam Clerk, will you kindly set the timer for 30 seconds to assist anyone that might wish to speak and is having technical difficulties? This will allow time to overcome any challenge.
Thirty seconds has lapsed and there are no additional speakers.
All right, thank you, Madam Clerk. With that, the public comment period is now closed and the chair brings the item back to the council. We're now going to begin with our first business in order, which is public hearings. Item number 1, Mr. Metzler, will you kindly introduce the item?
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the council. This item is being brought back, resultant from the conversation we had at our March 17th early morning city council meeting to ultimately approve award a contract for the ultimate construction of the wellness center in downtown Victorville. Related to that was confusion that began at the March 15th meeting with respect to whether or not a certain vote requirement threshold needed to be met, relating to the question of whether or not the council wants to consider waiving or altering its bid requirements. And I raised that question particularly and underscore that question is because this particular item is being brought to you not to waive the bidding requirements as some people or one person in the public might think and it was just said, but instead this is focused more so on the question of whether or not the city council, if the council wants to consider waiving or altering its bid requirements for public projects, what is the vote threshold to be able to do that? And that's effectively what this item is really focused on. So it is, in fact, and I'll say it again, is not waiving the actual bid requirements. We're bound by your code. We're actually bound by public contract codes to bid projects. What created the confusion in this particular case, and which is why we had sought the waiver, is because the project that was brought before you actually did go through a public bidding process. It was just a public bidding process that is different than the traditionally controlled public bidding process we do internal here at City Hall. So with that, That's the reason for the item. The city clerk did read out the very technical elements as to the updates of this item. The co-author on this item with myself is Mr. DeBortnowski, the city attorney. I'll go ahead and allow him an opportunity to address anything that I may have missed, including, of course, next steps before this becomes codified.
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr.
DeBortnowski.
Metzler. If it's okay with you, Mayor.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Metzler. Yes, you covered it pretty well. I would just like to point out that while the city clerk read a number of revisions, essentially the only revisions were to preserve the supermajority from the prior draft that was distributed. We wanted to preserve the supermajority vote requirement for modifications or waiver of the bid requirement. We just needed to address a situation where we have, as you know, less than 5 council members, and our code didn't contemplate that. So this is essentially a modification of our code to address that situation, to keep it consistent with our charter provisions, to keep it consistent with the spirit of the Public Contracts Code as well. And to address the fact that this is being held at a special meeting, this is an ordinance, so it requires tonight's public hearing, but there will also be a requirement for a second consideration of this item, which I believe is going to be scheduled for the April 5th meeting. So the public has plenty of opportunity. We're not trying to hide anything here. This goes through the public hearing process, and like I said, it requires 2 actions at 2 different dates for the council to adopt this. It would then become effective 30 days after the second reading, should you so adopt. Be glad to answer any other questions.
All right. Thank you, Mr. DeBortnowski. And with that said, Madam Clerk, will you kindly read the recommendation?
That the Honorable City Council open and conduct the public hearing, close the public hearing, introduce ordinance number 2427 for adoption and first reading by title only, and waive further reading in full of proposed ordinance number 2427.
All right. Thank you, Madam Clerk. All right. Now we're going to move into technical questions for clarification, beginning with Member Becerra.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Metzler, the Victorville Municipal Code is written and brought to us by who?
Actually, it's the city council that has the authority over the municipal code. And in fact, this particular item is a good example about how your code is actually created and adopted. This is dealing with one particular code. As you know, the municipal code has a series of different codes that really are your local law. But it's not the residents that actually bring the code forward and vote on it. It's actually the city council that does that. And you start out typically with a public noticing process, which is just in fact what we did here, where we publicly noticed the intent to establish new law, new code in this particular case. After satisfying that public noticing process, we then bring the item before the council, just as we're doing here, or then the council then gets to deliberate amongst itself and then vote as to whether or not it wants to impose the new code, which is effectively, again, your local law. So it's really the authority of the council is where developing the code rests.
So back in 1968, when the city did start, the Victorville Municipal Code was probably what, 2 pages long? And the whole entire budget of $28 million for the city probably didn't even exist?
1962, and I wasn't here then. It's definitely safe to say that the code likely wasn't as voluminous as it is today. And I just don't recall what the budget was back then, but it was a different city back then.
So that's what I'm getting at. So as time changes, as our city grows, as different items come to front of us, is why we make alterations to our municipal code to go along with what's happening. For instance, us missing a council member. That's why we address these items at different times. We don't just make them up, we address them as they come to us, correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. And all contracts that are federally funded or state funded, they're required under certain laws that are held by them, the money they give us, that we are required to present paperwork of payroll, insurance, background information, everything on all contractors have to go through the state and federal government of paperwork that we have to show. We don't just make up paperwork saying, oh, this guy's a good guy, let's let him work for us.
Correct. As to the very last point that you made, there is a very defined process and set of rules that we have to abide by, both federal and state and even local. But yeah, we're required to maintain the records after we've been able to prove all of that, and then share it, of course, with the state or federal agencies at their request.
And all of our records are public records of any and all money received, correct? As
That-
long as a public record request is given.
That is correct.
Thank you very much. There are no further questions. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. All right, Member Gomez.
If the council wants to authorize, what would be the threshold and what has it been before in terms of this particular item?
Mr. DeBortnowski, would you summarize, I think largely what's already been summarized, but re-articulate what the vote requirement was and is going to be?
Sure. The threshold vote requirement under the current code is for a 4/5 supermajority, and the assumption is that that applies when there are 5 members. What we are doing is just modifying the code to address the situation when there are less than 5 members. We are preserving the supermajority requirement, therefore requiring a 3/4 vote.
Thank you. And when was the revision to this one item proposed?
We proposed it at the prior, I think it was the March 17th meeting.
That's correct.
And when was the public notified of such a change?
Public notices would have gone out 10 days prior to this public hearing.
So this is a special meeting, so we, in anticipation, posted this 10 days in advance. Is that what I'm hearing?
We posted not the special meeting notice, we posted the notice of the public hearing on public hearing item number 1.
What was that date?
It would have been 10 days prior to today's date. I don't have the exact date. I have to look at the calendar.
It was published in Valleywide newspaper on March 18th.
Thank
Was
you.
council member notified of this?
That's not our typical practice.
Okay, thank you.
However, the council was made aware as a part of my presentation at the March 17th meeting. I was clear to the council that we intended to bring back a code correction. Code correction should be understood to include proper noticing requirements, which is typically an administrative matter.
So are you alluding to the fact something of, you talked about this Victorville Water District? I do remember something like that being stated on March 17th, where the changes of regulations could occur then with that agency.
It was at that meeting and a part of that conversation.
Okay, thank you. And how does this change affect the City Council Library Board of Trustees?
It has no effect on them unless they are voting on a bidding process, and we only have 4 council members, but unlikely to have any impact on them.
How does this affect the SCLA Board?
Same.
Would you repeat what you stated?
It will only affect them to the extent there's a need to modify or waive typical bidding requirements that are set forth in the code, and in a situation where we have less than 5 sitting council members.
So you said modify and waive if we have less than 5 council members?
Right, they could rely on this provision in the event we have less than 5 council members, if there is a need at some point to modify or waive the current city council bidding requirements and go with other bidding requirements, which is what's happened here. We have gone with a full bidding requirement, just not the city's code.
Okay, and how does it affect the successor agency to the redevelopment agency?
In the same manner,
Okay, and how does it affect the city housing asset successor?
in the same manner.
What about the Housing Power Finances Financing Authority?
Again, it would be in the same manner.
And how does it affect the Victorville Water District?
It does not affect the Victorville Water District. The Victorville Water District is a county water district and has its own set of bidding rules.
And why is the city attempting to conduct a public hearing if it was already invoked to modify or waive the bidding process, which is included in section 2.28.230 of the Victorville Municipal Code?
This requires the adoption of an ordinance. Every time we modify the municipal code, it's done via ordinance, and an ordinance requires a public hearing.
And how is a special meeting qualify as a public hearing on a day that isn't normally situated during a regular meeting?
As long as a public hearing is properly noticed, as this was, you can adopt or introduce an ordinance either at a special meeting or at a regular meeting.
And can you define the term absolutely necessary?
I think that speaks for itself. It's
It
something-
doesn't. That's why I'm asking. I apologize for that. I just need clarification.
Something that must happen.
Must happen. Is that legal terminology to cover the must absolutely necessary? It's language that I'm finding in the reporting. So I want to make sure that that's accurate.
I think absolutely necessary is the better legal term. Must happen is probably a layman's way of getting to the same point.
You stated that the municipal code is not for the people to vote, but for the city council.
Your
So-
time is up.
Thank you, Member Gomez. All right, Mayor Pro Tem.
Yes, thank you, Madam Mayor. I have a couple of questions. But first, for the record, I'd just like to say I'm not a strong proponent of the design build model. I've seen where it's worked to the disadvantage of owner agencies and community at large. So I'm not particularly fond of the design build model, and I have a concern that we may be going down that rabbit hole. I'm also not a believer in conspiracy theory, but what I learned last week at the last meeting is that we already had a resolution that waived the what am I trying to say, the bidding process. And I can't help but wonder, why are we looking at this language when we already had that in place? Not unless outside of this particular instance with the wellness center, do you foresee that we might need to utilize this language in the future for other projects?
It is possible.
Right, so it is possible that we as the owner agency, we could entertain design build for other projects. That's what I'm kind of concerned about.
Yeah, and so I want to speak to the design build part and then perhaps have Mr. DeBortnowski speak to the intent of the code relating to the veto power that exists in this circumstance where we have less than 5 members of the council. I'm not a big proponent as well of design build, and I think the design build is being referred as a part of it being a part of our existing code. The project that we're actually working on it would constitute or qualify more as design bid build, which is our typical process where you actually retain the architect, design the project, have the project bid based upon those design works, and then build from that. And that's
Right.
actually the process that we followed here.
Well, right, because I'm thinking we could get the lowest builder, but not the most competent person. Then we have lots of change orders and we're paying more than what it actually costs.
And that exact point that you're making was one of the factors. Now, it was one of the risks that we were certainly willing to take as a part of round one, home key round one, when that type of deadline that was given to us, I think it was the $15 or $16 million. When we had first been awarded, that was the process that we were considering, was the design build. And that was the only chance we believed we had at the time to be able to construct the facility within the deadline that was imposed to us. But backing off and not proceeding with home key one and releasing those monies, one of the things that we consciously did so that we can be better prepared for a round two, as an example, we went ahead and continued the funding of the design work using PLHA money. And we actually finished off, well, we came pretty close. I think we got 90% done with the design work, but we effectively completed the design so that we could, upon award, be much more closer to our preferred way, which is design bid build.
Right, well, I've seen this in education. I'm not familiar with the municipalities. Are there other, I mean, certainly this isn't the first council that's operating with the 4-member council that requires 5. So are there other municipalities that have modified and adopted new language in their code? That's one question that's going to help me get to where I need to be. And the other thing is, obviously, this is a handicap, having a 4-man board when it requires 5. Are we also, don't we require a supermajority in the event we need to amend the budget? Are we going to modify in that area too? you can correct me because I'm just asking.
Yeah, and I'll let Andre speak to the supermajority or the vote requirement for the budget, but this item is not intended to carry over and satisfy any vote requirements for the budget.
But you understand what I'm saying? We're kind of treading in an area. I want to know how deep are we going to
Your time is up.
go? Thank you.
And I would respond and characterize it as I don't see us as treading very deep away from or far away from what our code currently says. I think the only real difference is that what's being asked for here is taken into consideration the dynamic that exists with our current council makeup of 4 members and avoiding a situation where under current code, because you don't have a full 5 makeup, it effectively creates a veto power of 1, which was not, and we can't find that anywhere intended in our existing code, to where we're basically adapting our existing code so that it's still somewhat consistent. We're proposing new code so that it's still somewhat consistent with the existing intent of the code as it deals with waivers. So saying it differently, if it's 4/5 requirements, if we have a full makeup of the council, since we don't, and accepting that, these provisions are speaking specifically to if you have less than the 5, in this case 4, you're still requiring the same supermajority. In this particular case, it'd be 3/4.
I understand, but I'm sure there's somewhere, I'm sorry, may I continue?
Yes.
With-
Actually, your time was up. so,
Okay,
Yeah.
all right.
Otherwise,
If I
absolutely.
may, with respect to the budget, that
I would
requires-
like to make a motion to extend her time to question.
Is there a second?
Cora, I second that. May I?
Oh, Madam Clerk, you can take the vote.
Sarah? Councilmember Gomez?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Irving?
Yes.
Mayor Jones?
Sure.
Motion passes unanimously.
Yes.
I'm
On
gonna
that
make
thought,
it, yes,
yes.
ma'am. I'm gonna make it quick. So are there other instances where we need a supermajority? Like a 4/5 vote? Are we going to amend that area as well?
There are 1 or 2, for example, an urgency ordinance requires it if we're to adopt an urgency ordinance. The budget, however, does not. The budget adoption requires just a majority vote. So we don't have an issue
Okay.
here. So it's very, very, very rare instances where this would be, and that's why it has tripped us up with respect to the bidding requirement. And as Keith said, it was never intended to enable a council member to have veto power. And so that's what
Okay.
we're trying to avoid.
Okay, my last question, this is the one that's really important. Have you done any research or are you aware of any other municipality or agency that's modified and adopted their language to fit the particular dynamic that we face here?
We've looked, we have not found anything. We did, however, find something in the public contracts code that addresses a situation where, for example, you'd only have 3 council members. Now they have modified the voting requirement to allow a 2/3 vote. So this is consistent with the spirit of those provisions. But to answer your question, we did look. We haven't found any other councils that are stuck with 4 council members.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you. All right, so I just have a few. So, Mr. Metzler, this proposal for an amended ordinance came about as a result of an unintended consequence that came out in a few meetings ago. It's not related to, it's not directed because of a project. It's an unintended consequence
I would
in the voting.
I would characterize as it's an unintended consequence of not having a full makeup of the city council.
And it wouldn't have mattered who had that veto vote at that last couple meetings ago on Tuesday. It could have been me for all that, but it was that consequence still would have arisen.
That is correct.
Okay. And presently, our ordinance requires 4/5, which cutting it down a different way is to say that you need at least all affirmative votes except 1. Okay, correct?
That is
Okay,
correct.
so knowing that we only have 4 members, this is just allowing for 4 members. It would still require all affirmative vote, at least all affirmative votes except 1.
That's correct.
So the intention here is to maintain the same standard, whether you have 5 members or 4 members on the council.
That's exactly correct.
And so what we're doing is really to maintain the spirit and the intent of the original ordinance.
That is correct.
So it in no way deminimizes it, takes away from it. If we have 5 council members, we still need a minimum of 4 votes affirmative. If we have 4 council members, we still require a minimum affirmative vote of 3 votes.
That's correct.
Correct, okay. And I think that is, and there's nothing about what we're doing tonight that would be considered in any way shady or legal, Mr. D. Portnowski.
Correct. There's nothing shady about it. And for the public's benefit, this project is being fully publicly bid.
Okay, perfect. All right, those are all my questions. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and open up the public hearing. Madam Clerk, do we have requests to speak in chambers?
We do have a card for Mr. Catillo.
Yes, welcome.
Mr. Catillo?
Welcome to our meeting. If you'll step up to the podium.
We're on public hearing item number 1. Are you wishing to speak on that item? Public hearing item number 1. Are you wishing to speak on that item? That time's already passed. That time has already passed. We're on public hearing item number 1. So if you wish to speak on that, you can have the floor. No, not unless you're wanting to speak on that item. We can
Thank
discuss
you,
it
sir,
after the meeting.
very much. Unless you wish to speak to item number 1, we're going to move on in this meeting. Thank you very much, sir. All right, Madam Clerk, are there any other requests to speak in chambers on public hearing item number 1?
No, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Do we have any requests via Zoom?
No, Madam Mayor.
Okay, with that said, the chair closes the public hearing and brings this item back to the council. Will the clerk please read the title of ordinance 2427?
An ordinance of the City Council of the City of Victorville, California, amending subsection 2.28.230B of Article 4 of Chapter 2.28 Purchasing System of the Victorville Municipal Code to modify the vote requirement for adopting resolutions, making findings, and authorizing exceptions to bidding requirements in limited circumstances.
All right, thank you, Madam Clerk. With that said, the chair invites a motion from the Victorville City Council as to points 3 and 4 on the agenda.
Motion to approve, Madam Mayor, for staff recommendations on ordinance 2427
Okay, as to points 3 and 4?
as to points 3 and 4.
Yes, all right. Is there a second?
There's a point of order. Are we combining them and is that a motion?
Okay, the point of order is not well taken. We are simply, the chair simply requested a motion on item number 1 as to points 3 and 4 in the recommendation. Is there a second? Chair seconds. Discussion on the pending motion. Member Becerra.
No discussion?
Thank you. Member Gomez is precluded from speaking as she spoke as a member of the audience. Mayor Pro Tem Irving.
Yes, I have a couple of comments. In no way do I want to get in the way of us building out our wellness center. But last week, 2 weeks ago, that fiasco, I see that as, without any disrespect to any one person, because I don't know who it would be, I see that as someone was sleeping at the wheel because you already had a resolution in place. That's how I see it. And, if we're really going to try and work around the disability or handicap of having a 4-man council when we need to have 5, I'm not sure why we're not looking at other areas that require a 4/5 vote. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And I so fully appreciate all the comments this evening. I had that concern as well too, but I think it was from an abundance of caution that we brought the resolution back, not anticipating any challenges, since the council member voted in the negative was the actual party who moved the original motion on the first resolution. All right, with that said, the public comment period is, the discussion is now closed. Madam Clerk, will you please take the vote?
Councilmember Becerra.
Yes?
Councilmember Gomez.
No.
Mayor Pro Tem Irving.
Yes.
Mayor Jones.
Yes.
Motion passes with Councilmember Gomez voting no.
Okay, so the council has just taken action in accordance with the recommendation posted on the agenda as to points 3 and 4. We're now going to move on to our next order in business, which is written communications. Item number 2. Mr. Metzler, will you introduce it, please?
Thank you, Madam Mayor and members of the council. First, I'd like to say this item is a long time coming, as it is a very voluminous study, very involved study. And I think first, because it's so complex, is the reason why we wanted to have this workshop with you to provide introduction of the subject before we ultimately intend to make a recommendation to you and seek approval in modifying DIF fees, which DIF stands for Development Impact Fees. And we're currently envisioning bringing this item back to you at the May 17th, 2022 meeting. The one thing a couple of things I'd like to identify. First, we commonly refer to the study as DIF, but this is the first time we've really had the opportunity that I'm aware of in the 25, 26 years that I've been here, where there's been an effort to do a full-blown comprehensive study. So as we last studied DIF, that was back in 2006, so well over 10 years ago. And that particular study focused on the parks and recreation fees, the fire fees, the police fees, public buildings and road fees. And just so that you're aware of what this study does, or what the study did back then, is in connection with all new development, there is an understanding, and it's a part of the CEQA process, that for all new development, environmental impacts have to be considered and adequately mitigated before it can be approved. And we're familiar with that process through the Planning Commission process, and ultimately the approval at the Planning Commission process before permits are actually issued. Development triggers an impact to cities in the sense that there's demand for increased roads, increased facilities such as parks facilities. Maybe there's new sports complexes that are envisioned as necessary to mitigate some of the impacts of new growth. And so that's in general the purpose of a development impact fee. So we had last studied that in 2006. But why I say this is comprehensive is that this goes beyond just those fees that I'd mentioned, but also considers a fee for drainage capital, which hasn't been studied since 1990. Sewer capital, at least as it relates to sewer, it's the collection system, which is the actual pipes in the roadways that we own and maintain, along with the water system, which water system was actually done last in 2013. And one of the things that we wanted to accomplish in doing it comprehensively is, absent doing it comprehensively, we either subject ourselves to missing periods of time where we don't study some of those other infrastructure systems, or we hodgepodge them to where we're actually considering, say, DIF in one year and then another infrastructure system in another year. So this attempt is really to bring them all together and deal with it at one time. And then in theory, to the extent it's appropriate to revisit it, say in 5 years, then we'd revisit them all in 5 years, as opposed to revisiting some here and there over the course of the next 5 years. And I bring that to your attention because there should be no surprise, considering in many cases we haven't studied some of the fees in several years. I think it's easy to expect that there are going to be recommended increases, and those recommended increases are likely going to be the focus from stakeholders as to whether or not the increases are appropriate. And one of the things I want to make sure as we proceed is that as we do proceed, and start focusing on increases, that we are looking at an apples to apples comparison, because this study considers so much more than what we studied in 2006, which was the very standard development impact fees for, say, parks, fire, police, and public buildings and roads. So with that, we do have a presentation that I'm going to turn it first over to Ms. Janelle Davidson, who's the Deputy City Manager that's been leading the team that's helped provide all the input information to the consultant, which is NBS, and she'll turn it over to them for the presentation to you on this diff study.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Metzler. Before I jump into the presentation, I wanted to take a minute and make the council aware of the consultants that we have online via Zoom this evening, who will have participated in preparing the studies and some of whom will be participating in the presentation. We have Joe Colgan and Nicole Kissam from NBS. We have Alice Boo and Alan High Street, also from NBS. We have Richard Ruiz and Steve Runk from DTA. Next slide, please. Okay, so I am going to go over a little bit of background information on the project, and then I will hand it over to Mr. Colgan and Mr. Ruiz to provide an overview of the diff studies and the resulting fees. I will then run through a number of sample project calculations that I believe will help you better understand by providing a comparison of current fees with proposed maximum fees resulting from the study. I'll also go over some steps that we have taken up to the point of this presentation, the feedback that we've received from stakeholders so far, and the next steps to bring this forward to the council with recommendations. Finally, we'll have a section for questions and comments. In addition to the consultants that I already named, you do have your executive team, your leadership team there in the audience, and some other staff members who can help assist with questions. Many of us have participated in this project. Next slide, please. Okay, starting with the background, as Mr. Metzler explained, most of these diff studies were last updated between 2006 and 2008 with a few outliers. We started this project back in October of 2019, and the initial goal was to complete the study in March of 2020. Obviously, we've had a few setbacks since then, but the scope of the project included this diff study. It also included a citywide user fee study component and a cost allocation plan, which has been completed. Part of the project had already been initiated under separate contracts. So we have a separate group in NBS that was tasked with the sewer study, and that study is included in the citywide study. It's found as Appendix D in Attachment A of tonight's agenda. And then we have DTA that was tasked with the regional drainage portion of the study, and that can be found in Attachment B. Since this project was initiated, we obviously ran into several delays due to COVID, which required that we stop and restart the project a couple of times. We also underwent some reorganization and staffing changes that required reworking the studies or certain sections of the studies. And we had new legislation, AB 602, which Mr. Colgan will talk about in just a moment here, that threw some additional factors into consideration to complete these studies. And with that, if we could advance to the next slide, and I will hand it over to Mr. Colgan.
Thank you, Janelle. Mayor Jones, council members, my name is Joe Colgan. I'm representing NBS in this presentation, and we did the overall diff study, and another group in NBS did the sewer capacity fee study. So I want to start by just talking a little bit about impact fees generally. They're imposed as a condition of approval of development projects to pay for capital facilities that are needed to serve the new development. They may not be used to pay for maintenance or operations, and the impact fees are governed both by constitutional case law and by California statutes, including the Mitigation Fee Act and also the recently passed AB 602, which we'll talk about shortly. Next slide, please. So in order to adopt impact fees, the city must show a legal justification. In case law, that's often referred to as a nexus or connection. And in the Mitigation Fee Act, it's called a reasonable relationship. So the city must demonstrate that there's, say, a reasonable relationship between the impact fees that are being imposed and the impacts that are created by development on the facilities that are to be funded by the fees. Now, a good way, I think, to break down that nexus or reasonable relationship is into three parts. First, it must be shown that development creates a need for the facilities that are funded by the impact fees. Development must receive a benefit from those facilities that they're paying for. And also the impact fees must be proportional to the impact that's created by a particular development project. Next slide, please. Now, just toward the end of last year, AB 602 was enacted by the state legislature and signed by the governor, and it added a number of provisions to the set of rules that apply to impact fees. One of them was that it requires impact fees to be based on the existing level of service provided for a particular type of facility, unless another basis can be justified. Starting in July 1st of this year, on July 1st of this year, it requires residential impact fees to be proportionate to square footage. Now, non-residential impact fees, commercial, industrial, and so on, are commonly charged on a square footage basis, but for the most part, up to now, until recently at least, residential impact fees were charged on a per unit basis, usually for say single family or multifamily development, different types of residential development, but they were based on units. So for fees adopted after July 1st, there's a strong implication that they should be proportionate to the square footage, the size of the unit. Also, AB 602 requires that large jurisdictions, which are defined as counties of over 250,000 or cities within those counties, must adopt a CIP as part of the Nexus study. And there's also a requirement for online posting of a good deal of impact fee information, including annual reports, impact fee studies, fee schedules, and so on. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the process that we went through for this impact fee study, and it's typical of all the studies we do, although for particular types of fees, it may require some adjustments. But we usually start by adopting a baseline of existing development and a forecast of future development so that we know what the demands are for facilities. We analyze facility needs using a level of service standard, or as I mentioned earlier, the existing level of service for each facility. And I would say that in the past, for many types of facilities, we have commonly used the existing level of service as a basis for the fee calculation. So that requirement of AB 602 really isn't a major departure from what we've done in the past. Then we quantify the impacts of development on the need for additional facilities, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide. We compile cost estimates for the future facilities, and we allocate those costs to various types of development based on the demand that they're creating and calculate the impact fees. Next slide, please. So we often ask, how do we quantify or measure the impacts that development has on a particular type of facility? And it differs for different types of facilities. Say for things like parks, recreation facilities, libraries, and so on, it's almost universally practiced that population is used to measure the need for those facilities. For some other types of facilities that serve both residential and non-residential development, and in this study, it was only used for general government facilities, we use something called service population, which is a weighted composite of resident population and jobs or employees working in the city. And I don't want to get into a lot of detail. If you have questions about that, we can dig into that a little bit more later because it can get a little involved. For police and fire facilities, we use calls for service per year. For drainage, we use added runoff created by development. That was actually done as part of the DTA study. And then for water and wastewater, we use quite often water demand, wastewater flow, but sometimes for wastewater, there are other factors involved, and I won't get into that, but the experts who did that part of the study can talk about it more if you have questions. Next slide, please. Now, I just want to go through a list of each of the fee types that we worked on. There's a lot of information on these slides. I don't think it's necessary for me to address it point by point, but I will try to cover the highlights on each of these slides. For parks and recreation facilities, I would reiterate that those are based on the city's current level of service. For example, for parks, it's based on the current ratio of park acreage to the existing population. Those fees were last updated back in 2006. The service area shown as the city limits, and I would point out that that means as additional areas are annexed to the city, the fees would also apply to them. I mentioned earlier, we use population to measure the impact, and then below that you see at the bottom a list of the types of projects that the fees would be used to pay for. Next slide, please. Fire protection facilities. I think it's obvious that new development requires additional fire protection services. One thing I didn't notice when we went through these slides earlier, and something that I should mention here to clarify it. This slide says that these fees are based on the city's current level of service. That is not precisely accurate. What we did in this case was to look at, because some of the existing fire stations will serve future development as well as existing development, and a future fire station will probably serve some existing development. There's really no way to look at an existing level of service that really makes sense for fire protection facilities. And so what we did look at was the level of service in 2040. We're projecting future development out to 2040. So we allocated the cost of these facilities based on the shares of demand, that is calls for service per year from existing development and future development. So the costs were split between existing and future development on that basis. You can see the list of projects at the bottom, list of future fire station 316 plus additional engines, medic squad, ladder truck, and so on. Next slide, please. Police facilities. This is pretty straightforward. These fees were calculated so that they would provide funding to maintain the existing level of service. And in this case, that's defined as the relationship between the value, the replacement value of the city's existing police facilities and equipment, and the number of calls for service per year. And so there's an additional correction I need to make on this slide. It shows the demand variable as population. That should actually be calls for service. And so the money would be spent for additional square footage at the police stations, and as well as fleet and equipment expansion. Next slide, please. The impact fee for public buildings addresses City Hall, Corporation Yard, and a few other facilities. So in this case, the fees are based on maintaining the city's current level of service, again, based on the relationship between the replacement value of the existing facilities. And in this case, it's that relationship to service population, even though it shows population here, the demand variable for public buildings was service population. And again, that's a composite of both resident population and jobs or employment in the city. And that's done so that it takes account of demand both from residential population and non-residential population. And these facilities serve both. So the money would be spent for additional facilities at the maintenance yard, City Hall security upgrades, parks maintenance yard, and so on. Next slide, please. The library impact fee, this is actually a new fee to fund additional library facilities and materials. It's based on the relationship between the existing population and the replacement value of the city's existing library and the materials that are the collection that's used by the library. This is, again, pretty straightforward, I think. I know you have a library master plan, and we took account of that in establishing the plans and the needs for future library facilities when we calculated these fees. Next slide, please. Water system improvements. Now, the next three types of facilities are a little bit different in the way we have to deal with them, because they're all engineered facilities. And in order to calculate these fees, we have to have engineering studies that establish the specific facilities that are required to serve future development. So we're still, level of service is still an issue, but it's sort of built into the engineering studies that are used to establish the need for specific facilities. In this case, these fees include both the cost of water system improvements such as distribution pipelines, reservoir storage, new groundwater wells, and other related improvements, but it also includes additional water rights. Now, the city's existing fee schedule includes a capacity or impact fee or water capacity fee that covers both the system improvements, and there's also a component called the alternate water source fee, which covers the cost of water rights or other sources of water supply to serve new development. This obviously is pertinent to the Victorville Water District service area and any areas within the city sphere of influence that are served by the district. The demand variable in this case was average day water demand. And as I mentioned, the fee revenue would be used for a variety of system improvements as well as water rights. Next slide, please. Road improvements, again, this is based on a specific list of future improvements required to serve new development in the city. There's also consideration of the San Bernardino County Transportation Authority's Nexus study, which relates to some of the fees that are funded by regional fees. The demand variable for these fees is peak hour trip generation. So we're measuring how much additional traffic development is putting on the road, and these the revenue from these fees would be used to build a variety of improvements, including interchanges, bridges, new and widened arterial roads, and traffic signals. Next slide, please. Sewer capacity fees. These fees I did not work on. You can see the basic information here, and if you have questions about that, we can have Alice Boo or Alan High Street respond to those. But I think for now, I'll just move on to the next slide, which gets us into, next slide, please. Which gets us to the administrative fee, which is a very small fee that's added to all of the other impact fees to cover the cost of mandatory administration that's required to comply with the Mitigation Fee Act. It's 0.2%. That's a very small additional fee, but it's important to recover those costs. Otherwise, the city would have to make them up from the general fund or some other sources. Okay, next slide. Now we're onto the regional drainage fee, which was done by DTA. So I'll hand this off to, I think, Richard Ruiz to talk about this. Is Richard there? So Janelle, do you want to just go ahead and I'll quickly talk about this, because this is very similar to all the other impact fees in the sense that It's funding increased capacity for the regional drainage system. It covers both the city and the SCLA master plan area. Similar to the other impact fees, it's based on the cost of additional facilities, and the fee calculations are based on the added runoff from new development. So the next slide is also about drainage. And I don't know enough about this one to talk about the details.
Joe, this is Steve Runk. Can anybody
Hi,
hear me?
Steve. Sure.
Hi, I know Rich is having internet issues, so maybe I can jump in and help out.
Yeah, please do.
But the two areas we looked at, the general city, citywide, and then the airport area, SCLA. And for SCLA, most of the development is non-residential, new development. So as Joe mentioned, we used a relative runoff method, and the area of benefit would be that the drainage area around that airport area. There were engineering studies that determine the pipe sizes, the channels sizes, the basins that were involved, and we ran a high-level cost estimate on those facilities, and then allocated those costs to new and existing development. And the results are shown in this table for the two areas. And then there was some offsetting revenue for outside funding sources for a total of $278 million. So that in general is the drainage.
Okay, thanks, Rich. Now we have some summary tables, summary fee tables. The next one shows the city's existing citywide impact fees. And one thing I want to point out here is that a number of the categories that are listed here don't actually exist in the existing fee schedules. So because we've added a variety of new development types to the impact fee schedule, the staff went back and showed in this table what those types of development were being charged under the current fee schedule. For example, professional office and lodging and service stations, I think, were just being charged as commercial development. And you see the asterisk next to some of these development types, which refers to the fact that those categories don't exist in the current fee schedule, but this table shows what they were being charged as under other categories. I don't think we need to get in too much into the numbers here, because shortly the staff is going to present some example projects to compare the existing fees with the proposed fees. So let's go on to the next slide, which shows the fees proposed in the current studies. And again, I don't think there's much point in talking about the numbers. There are just too many of them here. But you will see some example projects that will compare what a project would be charged under the current fee schedule and what's proposed under the fee schedule that you're seeing here. Next slide, I think, is for water system improvements. The fees are charged based on meter size. And so you see here the existing and proposed fees. And these increases are actually quite moderate. One more table, I think. Sewer capacity. I think the existing fees dated back to the early 1990s, if I'm not mistaken. And so there's a rather large increase in the proposed sewer capacity fee. And this is per equivalent dwelling unit, or EDU, which is how those fees are characterized. Next slide is the regional drainage system. Let's see, shall I hand this back off to DTA? I don't think there's.
Sure, this is Steve. I don't know if Richard's solved the computer problem, but this shows the increase in fees, but largely that's due to recent engineering studies, more comprehensive studies, the older fees go way back in time. So it's not surprising that we'd see some increases in non-residential. However, the fees are pretty close to similar programs with other municipalities. So that's, I'll hand that back to you, Joe.
Okay, and the next slide, I think, takes us to the example project, so I'll hand it back to Janelle.
Yes, thank you, Joe, and thank you, Steve. For the benefit of the City Council and the public, we thought it might be easier to help understand the comprehensive impact of the proposed fees if we showed some example projects. And that's because, as you saw in those last few tables, you have a number of fees there at the end, the water, the sewer, and the drainage, that are calculated based on different variables than some of the other fees. So the first three examples that we're going to go over are related to residential development. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this slide just to give you the lay of the land here. Across the top there, the example project is a single family home based on an average of 2,000 square feet. And then in the left-hand column there, we have listed all of the diff categories. In the case of residential, all of the diff categories apply. So the next column over to the right is going to give you the current fee. And then the next column over will give you the proposed maximum fee. And that last column will give you the percent difference comparing the two. Now, we've also footnoted a number of assumptions to help you understand the additional data that had to go into creating these examples. So in this case of a single family residence, the fee for the water was calculated based on a 3/4 inch water meter. The fee for the sewer was calculated based on 1 EDU. And the fee for the storm drain is based on, the acreage assumption on this is based on a 1/4 acre. So if you look across, you can see there's quite a difference category over category. But if you look at the bottom line, it's showing a 70% increase. And that in this example amounts to just over $12,000. But I do want to point out here that, again, most of these have not been updated in 16 years, in some cases longer. So if you divide that increase over that amount of time, you're really looking at more along the lines of 4.4% per year. Next slide, please. This next example is an apartment complex. The assumptions that we used were 272 dwelling units, approximately 22 acres, and it assumes an 8-inch water meter. So based on those assumptions, we come up with an increase of 87% in total. That's just over $2.1 million. Again, over 16 years, it sounds like a lot. There's a sticker shock there, but over 16 years, that's only just over 5% per year. Next slide, please. The mobile home park example is based on 70 mobile home units on just under 10 acres and assumes a 3-inch water meter. In this case, the mobile home category used to be included in the residential attached category, so it's now been separated out into its own category. That way we can apply the appropriate demand factors that align with mobile home parks. In this case, it is at a collective increase of 121%, or approximately $775,000. Over 16 years, that's an average of 7.6% per year. Next slide, please. Now, I want to point out a difference in the slides from this point forward. That left-hand column that lists the diff categories, previously all of the diff categories applied. However, for commercial, industrial, retail, the Parks and Rec and the library fees
Davidson, could you hold for just a moment? Mayor Pro Tem, we know that you have to leave. We appreciate your being here as long as you could. Thank you. Ms. Davidson.
Thank you. As I was saying, the Parks and Recreation and the library categories do not apply to these types of developments. So in this case, we're looking at a department store example, 10,000 square feet on just over an acre. And we assume 2 water connections here, a 1-inch and a 3/4-inch water meter. The overall increase is 292%. That's just over $336,000. So over 16 years, that's about 18% per year. Next slide, please. Okay, for our office building example, this is another fee that is currently calculated as retail and commercial. However, staff had requested that as part of the study, we look at creating some new categories that Mr. Colgan mentioned previously to help us better implement the rates and apply factors that are specific to certain types of development. So in this case, we're looking at an office building just over 16,000 square feet on approximately 1 acre. We have 2 water meter connections, an 1.5 inch and a 2-inch connection. Collectively, we're looking at a 45% increase, $91,000. Over 16 years, that only comes out to about 2.8% per year. Next slide, please. This is a hotel example. Again, currently this would have been assessed at the retail commercial category on a per 1,000 square foot basis. However, it's now a separate category and the proposed fees are calculated on a per room basis. We're looking at approximately 60,000 square feet, 105 units, approximately 10 acres with 2 separate water meters as noted at the bottom. This is an increase of 31% or $206,000. So over 16 years, that's about 1.9%. Next slide, please. All right, the industrial business park was an existing DIF category. In this case, we're looking at approximately 32,000 square feet on 2.75 acres with the 2 water meter connections noted at the bottom. This is a collective increase of 50% or approximately $100,000. Over 16 years, that amounts to about 3.1% per year. Next slide, please. Okay, High Cube Warehouse is also an existing DIF category under the current DIF structure. In this example, we're looking at 461,000 square feet on approximately 53 acres with a 2-inch water meter, two 2-inch water meters. And in this case, 62% increase, $654,000 over 16 years, that is 3.9% per year. Next slide, please. Self-service storage is another category that we called out separately under the study. It was formerly assessed at the industrial business park rate. In this case, we're looking at approximately 15,000 square feet on 2.75 acres with 2 different water meter connections as noted at the bottom. The collective increase is 48%, $31,000. That's about 3% per year. And our last example probably has the most sticker shock of them all. This is another category that we called out separately due to difficulties in calculating the fee under the current structure, which is retail commercial and on a square foot basis. The proposed fees are now calculated on a fueling position basis, and the convenience store in this example is calculated on a per 1,000 square foot basis. So in this case, we have the 2 1-inch water meters noted below. The collective increase is 808%. That's about $712,000. That still comes out to 50% increase over 16 years. The only other piece of information I would add to this example is that gas stations do tend to have a very significant impact, particularly you can see the increase on the roads line item there. We did apply a very generous factor to account for pass-by trips. but even so, the impact is quite significant. Next slide, please. Okay, this slide was just intended to notify the council of steps we had taken prior to this evening's workshop. We did complete the studies and send those out to our stakeholder groups on March 4th. We followed that up with a Zoom meeting that was recorded on March 10th. And then that recording, along with the studies and the presentation, were posted on the city's website on March 11th. And we encouraged our stakeholders to continue sending feedback beyond the scope of that meeting. We have not received much feedback to date, but from what we have received, we have been asked to consider a phased approach to implementation, like you heard Mr. Rodriguez mention earlier. We've also been asked to consider grandfathering projects that are substantially ready or underway, which is quite common. We've also been asked, separate from this DIP study process, to consider participation in infrastructure financing programs. These are essentially programs that are set up to where developers can finance DIP fees, and those fees are advanced through bonds and then repaid through property assessments. There are two programs that have been proposed to us by different developers. One of them is the statewide community infrastructure program known as SCIP, and that's through CSCDA. The other is the bond opportunities for land development known as BOLD, and that's through CMFA. Lastly, like you heard earlier in the public comment, there have been some general comments about concerns to the increased fees impacting development, most notable to affordable housing production. So we did want to call that to the council's attention. Next slide, please. As for next steps, like Mr. Metzler mentioned, the point of this evening's workshop was to introduce the council to the study, get you acquainted with this very complex matter, and to collect additional feedback so that we can finalize these studies and put together our staff recommendations. Those need to be published 30 days in advance of the public hearing that we plan to hold in May. So we are looking forward to hearing your questions and comments. And as I stated, we have our entire consultant team and our staff standing by. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Ms. Davidson. Keith, did you have anything else that you wanted to add before we get into questions and comments?
Just one thing to add, just so that you're not surprised at a later date. So there's been a very comprehensive effort bringing this study forward. There is still one additional study in the background that we were just not prepared to have it at this meeting, but similar to this, we're actually nearing the finalization of our user fee study, which, different than capital, actually is basically an update to our administrative charges associated with the services we perform. And we're expecting to bring that back ultimately on a parallel path. So that, I don't want you to be surprised when that does come back, but that is something that's been in the works and pretty close to being done. And we'll bring that forward also with a recommendation towards the end of May.
All right, thank you, Mr. Metzler. Madam Clerk, the recommendation, please.
Any direction given is at the discretion of the City Council.
All right, thank you. So we're going to go ahead and get into questions as to the presentation and a staff report. But since this is really intended to be a workshop, we'll go ahead and incorporate any comments into this period as well. So we'll begin with Member Gomez.
Yes, so since there's a collection of information, all of my questions are to be considered as feedback and modification of what's going on with this particular study. So I'm going to go through all my questions, not expecting a response because I only have 3 minutes and I want to make sure I place them on the record. And if any were to show up as modified, I know because I stated them for the record. So the first one is,
Member Gomez, just a minor clarification. So it's
can you
2 minutes.
please
It's a
stop the
2-minute
clock?
time
Because I
period.
know it needs to be
It's-
stopped. Thank you, I
looked at-
appreciate
They
it.
know. So the time period is 2 minutes, not 3.
Oh, thank you
That's-
for
yes.
that clarification. So to maintain the existing levels of service, to continue, we're using the population, which is very unfortunate. How can we ensure that you, NBS, obtain data on calls for service based on the cost for police facilities, vehicles, and equipment to be actual in this report? The next question, as feedback as well, as typically the city does a fee of schedule per need, one at a time, not all departments in all areas of the city. How manageable was this study to bring detailed data for accuracy? So in other words, I'm asking for detailed information. When will the city have the opportunity to adopt and implement the fees and increases? So in other words, it's unfortunate that we're going to see an increase in this. Hopefully it wasn't, and that's part of the modification that I would like to see. And the next one is, what type of analysis was conducted? What statistical tools were used to measure the impact fees based on the capital costs and the capital assets that are being explored and mitigated with any additional developments? And what determined picking one data over another to come up with partial increases or decreases? I believe we're on the 46th Amendment to the police contract, and Measure P is already implemented as well. I don't know if we consider those measures. And what's the police impact fees when compared to the development impact fees? CIP must be adopted for 250,000 or cities within the county. I wasn't sure if it's one or both. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Gomez. Member Becerra.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Mr. Metzler, the water usage in the aquifer, the water usage of new home pulls more water out of the aquifer, correct?
I just want to make sure I understand the question. The question is, does the water usage of a new home pull water out of the aquifer?
What I'm saying is our water fees are going up also, but our water fees are going up on a new home because as new homes are built, more people are pulling out of water out of the city's aquifer. So more homes means more water, correct?
That is correct. But one thing that I don't want to have lost on this conversation is the cost of the water is different than the cost of the capital. And so the focus of this conversation is the cost for the capital, whether it's tanks, transmission lines, in the case of water, wells. Those would be capital items that as a part of this study were in to address one of the comments earlier. The consultants are going to depend heavily upon the staff. That's why we have assembled a large team from members of our leadership team to actually provide that input data. So in the case of the water master plan, it's going to pull that information that I just talked about, the capital, and try to project a fee necessary to help fund those capital improvements when the growth triggers the need for those improvements. Different from the water consumption, where the water rate, for example, that we pay associated with our monthly bill, that's actually paying for the costs associated with the delivery of that molecule of water. So that's going to be actually pulling the water out of the ground, as you mentioned, but that's also maintaining the system, energizing the pumps so that the pumps are actually pumping water out of the ground into the tanks, maintaining the tanks so the gravity is feeding the system. So two different components. Today, it's focused entirely on the capital side of the house.
Okay. And then again, it said at the beginning, the fees have not gone up since 2006 to 2008, but yet roadway material has gone up 63%. Minimum wage has gone up 55%, and yet our fees have stayed the same since then.
That is a correct statement. And the reality is, there really hasn't been an opportune time as it relates to those core diff fees that were approved back in 2006 and updated in 2008. In the ideal, you update every 5 years. But of course, when you revisit the history of what took place over the last 15 years or so, that would have taken you into a recovery period where we were trying to recover from major recession that lasted for quite some time. And then, of course, when we started seeing things improve conditions-wise on an economics basis, our priorities over the last several years. And really, we had the opportunities to make meaningful changes starting in 2017, 2018. And our priorities, and we did make meaningful changes. This just hasn't been one of those priorities where we've been able to tackle, in 2017 and 2018. But as we've been successful at tackling those other priorities that this council has set forth, this now has risen to the forefront of needing to be addressed.
Okay. And the average home price in Victorville is still way lower than the California average home price.
That's my understanding,
Yeah,
correct?
I'm looking it up. All right. Thank you, sir. Very well put. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Becerra. Well, you asked one of the questions that I was going to ask, so I can scratch that one off my list. All right, so for me, this is like so much else that we're dealing with in life, sticker shock, right? Sticker shock at the pump, sticker shock in the grocery store, sticker shock with everything. So when this study was being done, it was prior to the current kind of cycle of inflation that we're feeling now. So it doesn't anticipate, I would imagine this doesn't even take into account inflation on capital projects or capital items.
I'm going to ask Mr. Colgan to speak to the inflation question. And I think that question more so is, has inflation been factored? And if so, to what extent? We did in fact start this well in advance, obviously, of the inflationary crisis that it feels like we're dealing with currently. But Mr. Colgan, can you speak to perhaps what measures you used?
Yes, all of the fees are calculated based on current costs, and we do recommend that the city review the costs periodically. Many cities do it annually, and make adjustments to the fees to keep pace with the cost of construction if necessary. So we don't assume anything about inflation in the future, but obviously that's an important factor that needs to be dealt with on an ongoing basis.
All right, so with a new law that is going to would impact us or anybody else after July 1 in terms of a study, I didn't realize that we could, excuse me, after this, we could review this annually and make adjustments. That's within our purview to do that. It doesn't have to be at a 6-year mark or an 8-year mark.
I believe that's correct, but I'm going to again refer to Mr. Colgan on that.
Yes, certainly. Many cities review fees annually and adjust them annually. And so you can certainly do that even without doing another study. I mean, you can simply look at a percentage increase in the cost of construction, and there are indexes that you can follow to do that. The Engineering News Record Index is widely used as a gauge of changes in construction costs, and you could simply apply a percentage increase to the fees each year to keep pace.
Okay, and Ms. Davidson at one point referred to some of the feedback that we had received prior to tonight's meeting. And one of them, I'm not sure I understood it correctly, but it sounded like one of them was perhaps passing on the costs of the development impact costs onto the, for example, a home buyer, and they're assessed annually. Did I hear that correctly?
I think that concept is more so supported by the request that we've heard from the development community relative to using financing programs. Those financing programs that are now available and being used, we just have not taken a position in that regard. But financing programs akin to a CFD, they call them something else, are now available where they actually can finance the costs associated with impact fees. And so that would be an alternative way of hitting the development up front and allowing those fees to be paid instead by the developer, but by the owner over time through the collection of basically an assessment to their property taxes.
Okay, so a version of a Melrose, sort of.
I would say that's a good comparison.
Okay. Do we expect, I'm going to throw this out there. Do we expect that this is going to hinder the growth that we've been looking forward to in our community?
That's really a hard question to answer.
That's why I asked.
It definitely is going to impact, and I think, that's one of the things that we, between now and making a recommendation to you, want to look at the numbers and be able to compare them against other jurisdictions, which this study does in fact do. But we want to make sure that at the very least, we're not adopting a rate structure that makes us uncompetitive, since this city has traditionally been pro-growth, encouraging all types of development, both residential and industrial largely, but not ignoring commercial. We just have traditionally been a pro-growth community. So one of the things, given all the feedback that we'll get now and over the course of the next few weeks, we'll factor that into the final recommendation.
Perfect. That's what I was hoping for. All right. That is all I have in terms of questions and comments, except for one. Very comprehensive report, exceptional presentation. I appreciate all of the detail in this and all the work that went on behind the scenes to bring this to the council. Beautifully done. All right. With that said, and not anticipating any motion, since this was really intended to be informative and a workshop, we can go ahead and conclude this meeting. That's all of our business. And so, as a matter of housekeeping, all council members, staff, and audience members will kindly vacate council chambers in City Hall within 10 minutes. That's 6:55, so that these facilities can be cleaned and secured for the evening. And members of the audience aren't permitted behind the dais. With all of that said, everyone have a great evening. Meeting is adjourned.